尊敬的各位领导、各位来宾、各位朋友，大家上午好。Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, honorable guests, good morning and welcome. How many people here speak Chinese? Feel free to raise a hand. Dr. Liu, thank you. What's so interesting about being at a conference like this is noticing how much of this is done in English and thinking how well equipped we are to understand the West. During our policy circles, people were asking me about China, about Belt and Road Initiative, and about the ways that China will be impacting the Middle East and the Arab region. But how well equipped are we to actually understand China? Understanding is not just figuring out policy direction. It's not just seeing what's in front of us, the next 5 years of investment, the next 5 years of trade partnerships. It's understanding what people want. It strikes me that there are few regions in the world that understand the importance of understanding what a people want more than the Middle East and the Arab region. I focus on youth. So I recently came out with a book called Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. And I run a think tank and consultancy called the Young China Group, where we try to understand how narrative impacts economic decisions and political decisions of this young generation. And so we're asking ourselves, why is this important to the Middle East? The answer is impact. I'm a millennial from the United States. There's a big to-do about millennials in the United States. Who will we vote for? What do we stand for? What do we want to buy? There are 80 million of us. There are 400 million Chinese millennials, more than the entire population of the United States and Canada combined, far more than the population of the entirety of Saudi Arabia. Whether you're thinking about selling solar panels, renewable energy, traditional energy, whether you're buying cell phones, soda, a new pair of jeans, whether you're thinking about international or global politics, but also who's buying up the apartment next to you, real estate markets in your neighborhood, this young generation will fundamentally change the way that you individually lead your life, lead your company, and perhaps even lead your country. So my question is for you, how well equipped are you to understand what this young generation, the generation who will be guiding China's powerful step leading into the future, as the Belt and Road Initiative plays out over time, how well equipped are you to understand who they are, what they want, and how they see the world? Quick about me, Ragada has asked me to tell you a little bit about my background. I think this is important only because I'm so ordinary. I'm from a suburb of California. I went to public school. I went to Columbia University, graduated in 4 years, took Chinese as a freshman and hated it. But I studied abroad in Hong Kong. I made the decision because I was a big fan of science fiction, and I figured I could go to Europe and see history, or I could go to Asia and see where everyone was saying the future was happening. I traveled extensively throughout mainland China, and felt strongly that the China that I was seeing, the China that I was experiencing, was far different than the China that was being described to me in the media, and then reverberating off of people who had been 2 weeks in Shanghai or traveled to the Great Wall. What I tried to do when I moved back to China at the age of 22 was first learn the language. After 2 years, I passed the highest level of fluency you could test for. And now that is one of the major tools that we use to understand, not the only tools, but one of the major ones to understand this young generation. So, understanding narrative and understanding impact is going to fundamentally change the way that we do business here, or we lead our countries here. There are 4 major differences that I'm going to talk about today. I specifically chose the differences not just between Chinese millennials and global millennials, but also the difference between old China and young China. Because the China that you think you know does not exist and will not exist moving forward. And the reason that is because China's pace of change is unlike anything that we have in the world, and it's very difficult to imagine. So I'm going to ask us to try to actually imagine what it would be like to grow up in China. I was born in 1990. In my lifetime, I've watched the American GDP, per capita GDP, increase 2.5 times, which is really incredible for a developed country. I mean, think about what that actually looks like. My neighbors, the type of car that they're driving, maybe the amount of tutoring that I was able to have as a child has gone up. The quality of my neighbors' lawns, the quality of our government, what they're able to provide in terms of infrastructure, that's increased 2.5 times in my lifetime, the relative family wealth. In China, the per capita GDP since 1990 has increased 25 times. Maybe it's just a developing country. Well, let's look at the other BRICS nations. India, 4.2. Brazil, around 3. Russia, just upwards of 3. In fact, when you look at all of the countries around the world, there are only 5 that have had per capita GDP increase in double digits in that time span. The only country that exceeds China is Equatorial Guinea. And if this room of people went to Equatorial Guinea for the weekend, we'd likely change the per capita GDP. What China has achieved in my generation's lifetime is without precedent. So these 4 differences. The first is open-mindedness. When we think of China, we often think of an insulated country, and that's true of the past. My friend's parents, who were born in 1950, describe a world in which they only interacted with through a 12-month calendar, Fields of Europe. That was the only understanding of the outside world, outside of slogans, catch up with America and surpass England. This young generation has grown up with the internet. Many of you tell yourselves that the internet in China is censored. That's true to an extent. My friends in China have grown up studying 10 plus years of English. They've grown up watching our TV, our movies, studying our politics, understanding our government. I have friends who can quote Barney from How I Met Your Mother and Martin Luther King in the same sentence. There's a fluency in the world in China that so far surpasses what the older generation had as to make it totally unrecognizable. This young generation has a global awareness. Second, capitalism. Isn't it ironic that the world's biggest communist government has created the largest capitalist success in the history of economics? Third, 421. I think many of us forget that China was bitterly poor. And so it used to be that China had a lot of young people and very few old people. In 1950, the average life expectancy was 36. So you didn't retire, you died. Because of a tremendous longevity revolution, and because of the one-child policy, that traditional Confucian population pyramid, many young people, very few old people, has inverted. The average life expectancy is around 75 now, and many families only have one child. So you have 4 grandparents for every 2 parents for every 1 child. That, by the way, when you think about problems that China faces, is it global leadership? Absolutely. But one of the biggest problems that I rarely hear anyone talk about is who will care for the old. And the fourth point, I think this is the most important for this particular conference, is pride. If you're an older person in China, you did not grow up proud of your country. China was known as the sick man of Asia. My friends describe their first real interaction with the West was the 1996 Olympics, the Atlanta Olympics. It was often the first time any of them had seen a TV. They would gather around in their communities, and their parents would point at the TV and say, "Look, that's the most powerful country in the world." My friends describe remembering how that year the United States won 48 gold medals and China won, I think, 16 or 15, which was already a coup for China, already a massive achievement. You fast forward to 2008, China's coming out party, the Beijing Olympics, what many pundits have said is the greatest show that has ever taken place in human history. That year, my generation, then 18, watched its country win 51 gold medals, and the United States won 36. So how important is a gold medal? What's the value of pride? During the policy circles yesterday, we talked a lot about youth. Today we talked about youth. I'm part of the cloud generation. I think we understand here better than anywhere how much either resentment or pride of the youth can influence politics, can influence economics, can influence stability. This young generation in China, who many of us think of as being oppressed, have a tremendous amount of pride in their country. By the "I'll believe it when I see it" metric, they are proud of what their country has accomplished. In terms of governance, they recognize that while their government is flawed, absolutely, this idea that this young generation isn't aware of the flaws of their government is ludicrous. 1 in 3 people studying abroad in the United States right now are from China. 2/3 of all passport holders in China are under the age of 35. Like I said, this young generation has interacted with the world. But while flawed, they recognize their government is effective. What's so interesting is over the last several years, we've watched the United States sort of delegitimize itself as a globalization partner, where it looks like every 4 years we might tear up a trade deal. China is currently in this region building its relationships in steel and concrete, not to last every 4 years, but to last over generations. Like I said during my speech earlier, good relationships are based on understanding. It's my hope that through understanding who this generation is and who China is, that we can start to build good relationships in this region and around the world. Thank you.